Coming up on episode 34 of Omnivore, a model for affordable, nutritious food systems, sleuthing solutions to biofilms in the plant, and the unintended consequences of food additive bans. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology Magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT First Annual Event and Expo. Join food science and innovation peers and thought leaders from around the world this July 14th through the 17th in Chicago. Go to iftevent.org to learn more and register today. That's iftevent.org.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. When he moved to Liberia during the Ebola outbreak in 2014, Taylor Quinn witnessed the horror of children dying of starvation simply because nutritious food was not available in local markets. Quinn founded his company Tailored Food in 2019 with the mission to combat hunger by partnering with both large organizations like UNICEF and small local entrepreneurs to bring affordable and healthy food to consumers in low-income countries. Recognized as one of Food Technology's 2024 Food System Influencers, Quinn spoke with Deputy Managing Editor Kelly Hensel about his experiences and what he hopes to achieve in the next 5 years.
I wanted to start kind of with your background, and I was looking on your LinkedIn page, and I see that you've gotten some education in social entrepreneurship, international development, social anthropology, and I was wondering why or what prompted you to home in on food.
I'd always been really curious by food, and food anthropology was a through line throughout my university degree. Honestly, I had, broadly speaking, worked in the social impact space, I would say, before I moved to Liberia in 2015, 2/3 of the way through the Ebola outbreak, for a work opportunity with the food company Just. But I was supposed to be setting up a charity project for for Just in Liberia. And then it sounds kind of cliche to say now, but genuinely, March 23rd, 2016, I had a meeting with this doctor at the hospital hardest hit by Ebola. And there was kids dying of malnutrition in the hallway outside of his office. Dr. Jude explained to me, he's like, look, Taylor, I feed kids with what UNICEF or the Red Cross donate to my hospital. I send these kids home and there's no advice I can give to mothers or grandmothers because nutritious low-cost food is simply not available in local markets, even though their families are spending tons of money on food. It's not that they're so poor that they have no money. It's like, no. And again, it's not that dissimilar to the US context to a lesser extreme sense, right? That like low-income families spend real cash every day on food, but yet, kids are struggling with all sorts of health challenges. Anyway, so Dr. Jude, to finish the story, he's like, look, if your food company can do something about it, that'd be pretty great. And I was 23 years old at the time and didn't know much about anything in the world, let alone how to build a nutritious low-cost food business in Liberia. But yeah, kind of one day at a time, and here we are, however many years later, 8 years later, actually.
And my next question was actually about what you did in Liberia, and obviously what you learned from that experience. It kind of changed the whole trajectory of your career.
Totally.
What else did you take away from that whole, developing a product, learning how to make it nutritious and affordable?
I think what I learned is that if you want to do this work and really selling delicious, culturally relevant, nutritious food to the lowest income people, it's hard. It's really hard, or it's hard and complicated to do. And so you have to look really at, literally what I learned is that you have to look at every stage of the food journey, from crops grown to how do you transport your crops to a factory? What type of power does your factory use? What type of equipment does it use? Who repairs that equipment when it breaks? All the things that sound obvious, but often with food projects, especially funded by kind of the nonprofit sector, there's not necessarily that comprehensive look at how to build a food project from kind of beginning to end. Yeah, in meetings today, even, we're talking about these things that we learned in Liberia that we've now applied in 20 countries. We've done 6.8 million meals sold so far. And more importantly, too, we're actually diverting money that's spent on food system projects that are not sustainable, we're diverting those investments to food system projects that are sustainable and kind of thoughtfully designed and most importantly, culturally relevant.
Tailored Foods has worked with large humanitarian organizations like UNICEF, and then you also work obviously with smaller entrepreneurs. And I was wondering, why do you think that approach is so important to do both?
It seems to be somewhat counterintuitive. Why work with a tiny community-based, women's cooperative and with the world's biggest humanitarian organization? But our interest is creating impact across the food system. And we find that the things we learn so deeply embedded in the nuances of packaging and the exact cost of peanuts in Mozambique or coconut in Liberia or the cost of motorbike repairs in Liberia, like whatever the exact kind of question of the day, kind of keeps us rooted in the reality and the nuance of doing this work. The UN World Food Programme, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the European Union, and USAID. UNICEF is now our biggest partner, and we are setting the food systems agenda for UNICEF in 15 different countries simultaneously right now.
What are you hoping to do in the next 5 years with your team, with your company, with people you work with? It's a huge question.
Yeah, it's funny because we literally just talked about this last night. We had a little internal what will our organization look like in 5 years conversation. We hope to have repeat projects with the world's biggest food system stakeholders, the world's biggest food companies who want to design products for low-income people, the world's biggest humanitarian organizations, the world's biggest funders of food system projects. We want to be working with all those people, and we want to be expanding our grassroots work at the same time, working with incredible superheroes who are committed to nutritious, delicious, low-cost food in their own communities. Because, let me tell you, it's like much easier to be me bouncing around to different countries, being on WhatsApp calls with our partners, than to be an entrepreneur in a complex economy selling bags of cassava every day. Like that is a grind, literally and figuratively. And so, continuing to support those incredible community-based entrepreneurs in trying to, provide them with the support they need to do what they do. And then maybe a final point, like I hope if we will have failed 5 years from now, if we don't have 10 to 15 other organizations we're kind of competing with, so to speak. I'm now trying to share our learnings as far and wide as possible, go to conferences, do projects where we train the staff at other organizations. 5 years from now, I think we will still exist, but I do genuinely hope that if we do our job right, UNICEF wouldn't need to hire us. They know how to build thoughtful food systems, right? That's really the goal.
Entrepreneur Taylor Quinn is a food anthropologist and the executive director of Tailored Food, a Liberian-owned business focusing on supporting a more affordable, nutritious food system. He has since expanded his model to 20 countries while also scaling up this approach at the UN World Food Programme. Read more about Quinn and 5 other 2024 food system influencers in the April issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
At IFT First Annual Event and Expo, July 14th through the 17th in Chicago, attendees will experience the science of food like never before. At IFT First, you'll find innovation in action and the latest research, scientific discoveries, and technologies fueling the future of food. The annual event is also the place to maximize one-of-a-kind opportunities to meet and connect with peers, colleagues, and thought leaders from throughout the value chain. This year's IFT First theme is Collaboration plus Innovation. How can food science and technology transform the food system? IFT First attendee registration is now open. Be part of the transformation and register today at iftevent.org. That's register today at iftevent.org.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Ask any food processor who's found biofilm in their manufacturing plant, and they'll tell you it's one of the toughest food safety contaminants to remove. Slimy layers of bacteria attach to equipment surfaces and trap other bacteria and debris in protective domes that can secrete toxins and contaminate food throughout the plant. In addition to being a public health risk, biofilms wreak havoc on operating efficiencies and significantly increase manufacturing costs. Science and Technology editor Julie Larson-Brischer chatted with consulting food scientist Rick Stier about the risks posed by biofilms in processing operations, and how to prevent them before they create serious food safety, quality, and economic problems for the business.
So, hi, Rick. I'm looking forward to our conversation today about battling biofilms.
Well, thank you, Julie.
Let's dive right in. Like, your article in this month's issue was really interesting from the perspective of, I don't think a lot of people know about how biofilms form in a food processing plant and become the food safety and quality issue that they are. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, most people wouldn't know a biofilm if they fell over it, but you probably have seen some. For example, the pool you go to in the summer, if you have a low spot that's in the shade, you might have stepped on that, found out it's slippery. Well, that's a biofilm that's forming. But in a food plant, well, we really don't want these things. Well, not all the time. Everyone uses vinegar. Mother of vinegar is a biofilm. And there's a lot of people who make their own vinegar today. And what do? They just transfer that mother of vinegar piece to the next bit of ethanol for the fermentation. But in food plants, we don't want these things because they can contaminate product with spoilage organisms, with pathogens. If they build up, they can adversely affect heat transfer. They can do a lot of things to not only cause physical problems to the food, but be a detriment to your operations. You don't want to have plugged screens or damaged gaskets because a biofilm has set up house there. And the bottom line is, these things can form in almost anything. Dairy, meats, proteinaceous are the common ones, and a lot of the early work is done in meat plants. But you can get them in juices, you can get them in vegetables. They'll even form in water systems. So, and formation is, can be fairly quick. So you get one of these critters floating along and it attaches to the stainless steel of the equipment or a rubber belt. And first it's a mild attachment, with what we call van der Waals forces. And I'm not going to go explaining van der Waals forces because that's for the chemists. But then they continue to form, that more attached to the surface. They'll start to produce polysaccharide-like materials and eventually glue themselves to the surface. And then, of course, with these polysaccharide-like materials, they're going to catch things, dirt, food particles. They'll start to collect. And someone like myself who's older probably remembers that old movie from the 50s called The Blob. Well, that's kind of what like a biofilm gets, big blob that sheds material. And it reaches a point where it becomes irreversibly attached, constantly sheds dirt, other organisms that make up the biofilm. And and again, if this is a biofilm that's formed through listeria, well, now we're contaminating all the product that's flowing over it. And that's something you don't want. Or you don't want it if it's a pseudomonad species that might have established this. You don't want that being shed into the product to cause spoilage down the road. So these are not good actors. And if they do form in your products, they're hard to get rid of. And that's a whole nother section.
Right. Have you ever witnessed like a worst case scenario with biofilm in a food processing plant?
Well, I've been lucky, touch wood. I've only run into them a couple of times, but one was in a green bean processor, and unfortunately, it was a listeria incident, which ended up resulting in closure of the plant. And the cause was poor sanitary design, which is one of the elements that we'll talk about in a bit on how to prevent these things. But the green beans were being blanched, they were being pumped through a pipe, but it was a large pipe, and the product flow did not fill the whole pipe. And when they cleaned, the cleaning did not clean and scour the whole pipe. So they were basically continuously inoculating product that went by.
Like you said, and I know you often say this, the best defense is a good offense when it comes to biofilms, meaning prevention is key. So, do you
Yep.
have any tips now on effective ways to prevent biofilm formation in the first place?
Yep. Well, the first thing you want to do is well-designed equipment, good sanitary design. And you've only got to go back in food technology for 6 or 7 months because, we did a piece in September, I believe it was, Julie, right? On sanitary design of equipment. And for those of you who are interested, go back to the old food technology or go on the internet and Google the American Meat Institute, who really funded a program under the leadership of Joe Stout, who is one of the premier sanitarians in our industry. He headed that committee that put together these principles of sanitary design for AMI. Now, you might say, well, I'm not a meat processor. I manufacture fruits and vegetables. Well, these principles apply across the board. They were developed by AMI, but these 10 principles follow and can be used by any industry. So that's the first one. Good sanitary design. Spend the money on equipment that's easy to clean, maintain, is not going to cause headaches down the road. Second is be aware of your products. There are certain things that have a potential penchant for forming biofilms. So dairy, meats are high on that list. The next is develop a good cleaning and sanitizing program. And make sure you spend the time and the effort to validate those cleaning protocols. Make sure they're effective against the worst foods that are going through your system. We have smart companies will validate their allergen cleans. Everyone should validate their cleaning protocol. Fourth is maintenance. And you think, well, we maintain our equipment, but little things like scratches, cracks, damaged gaskets, these can trap microorganisms, pathogens or non-pathogens, in the gaps, and they're harder to clean, harder to get rid of. So they can form a source for the biofilms to form. And lastly, how long are your runs? People tend to push. Okay, we want to do a 12-hour run. We want to do a 16-hour run. Those longer runs are going to raise the potential for a sanitation issue. So if you want to do long runs, maybe when you stop for morning break or lunch hours, hose off the equipment. Do something to minimize the potential for attachment down the road. And of course, with cleaning, I said validated. And that's, microbiological or chemical means. But again, you want that equipment to look clean, smell clean, and feel clean. If you run your finger over something and it's a little slimy, maybe you just didn't do the job that you should have done. So those are the preventions that we want to work with.
Well, thanks, Rick, for sharing your advice with us today on Omnivore. It's been a pleasure as always.
Well, I've enjoyed it. And, IFT does have other resources too on this. You just have to dig a little bit in the old literature.
Richard Stier is a consulting food scientist with international experience in HACCP planning, food plant sanitation, quality systems, process automation, GMP compliance, and food microbiology. You can find his article, Battling Biofilms, in the April issue of Food Technology. California's Food Safety Act, signed into law last October, states that by January 2027, 4 food additives, brominated vegetable oil, potassium bromate, propylparaben, and red dye number 3, will no longer be allowed to be sold or produced in the state. Since then, bills mirroring California's have emerged in Illinois, New York, and Washington. Food Technology's Kelly Hensel recently caught up with IFT Technical Services Manager Renee Leber to discuss the implications of these bans for formulators, product developers, and the food industry at large.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the dialogue column that this conversation is going to be based off of. And, obviously Jim and Craig are both toxicologists, and they wrote in their dialogue that the science really doesn't support most of these additive bans. And I was wondering, from your perspective, what is the driving force behind these bans and others that are popping up in various states?
I think the driving force behind these bans is consumer perception. So labels typically aren't written for consumers who might not know what all of the additives are, much less why they're in there, or the science behind the additives and what's already been done. We're living in a time of mistrust with consumers, and I think this is a perfect example of that. They feel like the transparency isn't there, and because of that, it's raising some alarm with them. A time when they're hoping to learn more and kind of educate themselves on what they're looking at, they feel like labels are continuing to get more complicated, and it's just causing a sense of unease that I think is leading to the bans that we're seeing.
So what are the consequences for food manufacturers of having this state by state legislative bans?
Yeah, I will. So the big one that everyone always assumes to jump to is 100% correct in this case, cost.
Yeah.
The first consequence to consider is the cost. There's going to be some added cost. The cost comes from the process of reformulation, which is lengthy and oftentimes costly. New ingredients. So typically when we start swapping out ingredients, it normally doesn't get less expensive. It's possible that a new formulation might be, but it's on the unlikely side of things. And companies now have to manage a patchwork regulation frame. And so that managing is also going to take expense and time and labor on their part, because they not only have what's happened already, but they have to continue to watch for any new regulations that come through. I will say, other side of the coin, I think it might present a time of innovation. We might see some additional solutions come out, and I think that we can potentially see ingredients that maybe wouldn't have their day in the sun, that might have a time where they become a little more prevalent and see some uptick in market share.
I like that last point that you made about the innovative side of it. Obviously, when ingredients are substituted, there has to be some reformulation, lots of reformulation, and things don't necessarily trade out very easily, right?
It's a very iterative process. So most people don't necessarily realize it, but very few times there's ever a one for one, even in ingredients themselves. And so typically companies will spend 2 months just figuring out a new formulation that can meet the consumer expectation of product attributes.
From a federal level, is there anything that you know of or your team knows of that's being discussed in Washington about these bans, and whether there's just a better solution, or if this is just going to be the way it is?
So it's caught Washington's attention, that is for sure. Jim Jones, the FDA Deputy Commissioner of Human Foods, has been talking about it. He's mentioned that a food chemical safety list will be published, and that food chemical safety is going to be a big focus for the FDA for a while to come. There is now a table of chemicals that has been released that the FDA is re-reviewing. And so what's nice about that is it's released to the public. So it does give a little bit more transparency, they're hoping. And the public will be able to see what the FDA is reviewing, what their thoughts on these are, and petition the FDA to add food additives to their list. And then they can see when they are added. So the FDA is hoping in this increase in transparency, it will help gain alignment.
We're watching very closely the legislation in other states, like Illinois and various states. Do you foresee these bans spreading?
So there is no way to know. We saw the ban pass in California, so it'll be interesting to see. It seems like many of the states at this point have the same structure framework as the California ban. However, we do see differences from ban to ban. And so that's another thing that'll be interesting to see from a company perspective. A lot of national distributors cannot ignore California. They are one of the bigger states. And so with that, it'll be interesting to see if other states follow in their footsteps or have any additional regulations.
I guess time will tell. So we'll keep an eye on that. And thank you, Renee, for joining me today and giving some insight onto this very important and timely topic.
Renee Leber spent a decade in product development and R&D roles at U.S. Foods, Freshway Foods, and Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream before joining IFT, where she currently leads the organization's concierge service, helping teams around the globe find solutions to everyday product development challenges. You can read more expert commentary about the science behind the safety of additives in the April issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, IFT First Annual Event and Expo. Accomplish a year's worth of business, idea generation, and career growth in just 3 days at IFT First this July 14th through the 17th in Chicago. Go to iftevent.org today. That's iftevent.org.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode. This is Omnivore.